For generations, the most consequential decisions shaping democratic societies have been made in rooms with no public record, by people with no official title, using mechanisms that are entirely legal and almost entirely invisible. Over 4 chapters, we trace the architecture of that invisible system, from how it is built, to how it purchases influence, to how it coordinates, to what happens when it is exposed. Chapter 1. The Architecture. The most powerful financial systems on Earth are not visible from the street. They do not appear on stock exchanges or quarterly filings. They have no public profile, no ticker symbol, no annual shareholder letter. They are structures, legal, institutional, architectural, designed not to grow capital, but to make it permanent. The family office is the basic unit of this architecture. John D. Rockefeller created the first recognizable version in 1882, a dedicated staff managing his personal affairs separately from his business operations. The idea spread slowly, then rapidly. Today, more than 10,000 family offices operate globally. Together, they manage assets exceeding $6 trillion. Most have no public presence whatsoever. A family office does not invest the way a pension fund does. It operates across time horizons measured in decades. It holds stakes in private companies, agricultural land, water rights, infrastructure assets, and pre-IPO equity. It employs tax architects, succession planners, and legal specialists whose entire practice exists to solve problems that ordinary advisors have never been asked to solve. The first principle of dynastic wealth is this: you do not preserve what you accumulate. You build an institution around it. And institutions, unlike individuals, do not die. The Medici Bank held accounts for popes and Holy Roman emperors for over a century. The Rothschilds built 5 simultaneous operations across 5 European cities precisely to eliminate any single point of failure. Every structural decision was a redundancy decision. Every layer of complexity was an insurance policy against outcomes that had already destroyed everyone around them. The families that survive across generations are not the luckiest or the most talented. They are the most architecturally disciplined. They built systems that could function without their founders. No critical dependency on any single person. No structural weakness that a sophisticated legal mind couldn't close. What they built was not wealth management. It was wealth infrastructure. The difference matters enormously. Infrastructure is not managed. It is inhabited. It shapes behavior without demanding attention. It runs the same whether the founder is present or has been dead for 50 years. In Chapter 2, we follow the next layer: how private capital moves from preserving wealth to purchasing the environment that wealth lives in. Chapter 2. The Purchase: how private capital buys the rules it plays by. In 1971, Lewis Powell wrote a memo that was never meant to be public. He was a corporate attorney 2 months from his appointment to the United States Supreme Court. The memo, addressed to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, was a strategic plan. It argued that American business had failed to defend itself against a cultural and political shift that was undermining the foundations of private enterprise. The solution, Powell wrote, was systematic investment in the institutions that shape ideas. Build think tanks, fund university chairs, cultivate media relationships, engage the courts. Within 10 years, the institutional infrastructure Powell described had been built. The Heritage Foundation in 1973, the Cato Institute in 1977, the American Enterprise Institute already existing but dramatically expanded. These are not independent centres of intellectual inquiry. They are funded positions in a long-term argument about who writes the rules of the economy. That argument has been enormously effective. The regulatory framework, tax structure, and antitrust enforcement posture of the United States today reflects in significant measure the institutional investment made by private capital in the decades following the Powell memo. This is the second layer of the architecture. After preserving wealth, you purchase the intellectual environment that wealth lives in. You fund the institutions that define what questions are askable. You staff the agencies that interpret what is permissible. You own, over time, the language in which policy is discussed. This is not corruption in the legal sense. It is entirely legal, which is precisely the point. The most effective form of political influence is the kind that requires no crime, because the rules were written to permit it. The Koch network went further than most. Charles and David Koch built what political scientists call a state within a state, a coordinated network of policy organizations, political action committees, and academic programs that could function as a parallel governmental infrastructure. They did not try to change the rules, they changed the people who write them. In Chapter 3, we examine how the largest family networks coordinate without ever appearing to, and why the absence of visible coordination is itself evidence of a very sophisticated system. Chapter 3. The Network. Coordination without communication. Here is a question that has occupied political scientists for decades. How do the most powerful families in the world coordinate their behaviour across industries, continents, and generations without leaving a record of having done so? The answer is not secret meetings, though those exist. It is shared institutions. Boards of directors are the most visible layer. A single individual serving on the boards of a major bank, a media company, a pharmaceutical firm, and a private foundation simultaneously creates information flows, relationship networks, and aligned incentive structures that no explicit coordination could replicate. The decisions made in those 4 boardrooms are not independent. They cannot be. Philanthropy performs this function at civilizational scale. When a dynasty funds a major museum, a medical school endowment, or a foreign policy think tank, it is not giving money away. It is purchasing a permanent seat at the table of cultural production. It is shaping what is considered important, what is considered legitimate, and who is invited to discuss either. This is the genius of the third layer. It looks like generosity. It is reported as generosity. The tax code treats it as generosity. And it is, simultaneously, the most sophisticated governance tool available to private capital. The Aspen Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg meetings, these are not conspiracy venues. They are coordination infrastructure. They allow the people who hold the world's largest concentrations of private capital to know each other, to understand each other's priorities, and to move in broadly compatible directions without ever requiring an explicit agreement. The network does not give orders. It does not need to. A sufficiently dense network of shared relationships, shared institutions, and shared assumptions produces alignment without direction. The participants do not experience it as coordination. They experience it as consensus. This is what makes the architecture so difficult to dismantle. There is no central node, there is no meeting to expose, there is no individual to hold accountable. There is only the pattern. A pattern so embedded in the institutions that shape daily life that most people never recognize it as a pattern at all. In Chapter 4, we examine what happens in the rare moments when someone does. Chapter 4: The Reckoning. When the invisible becomes visible. Every architecture of power has a vulnerability. Not a weakness in the conventional sense, not a flaw that its builders fail to anticipate, but a structural feature that becomes a liability under specific conditions. For the architecture of dynastic wealth, that vulnerability is transparency. The Panama Papers were released in 2016. 11.5 million documents from a single Panamanian law firm, Mossack Fonseca, revealing the offshore financial structures of 214,000 entities, including heads of state, oligarchs, and prominent families from more than 200 countries. The documents did not reveal illegal activity in most cases. They revealed legal activity, exactly the architecture we have been describing across these 3 chapters. The public reaction was instructive. The revelations did not produce systemic reform. They produced individual prosecutions in a handful of jurisdictions, some resignations, and a great deal of commentary. The architecture remained intact. Within 2 years, the volume of offshore financial activity had increased. This is the pattern that repeats whenever the invisible system becomes briefly visible. The specific actors identified face consequences. The structural conditions that produced those actors are left unchanged, because changing them would require the cooperation of people whose interests are served by leaving them in place. The historical exceptions are rare and instructive. The progressive era reforms of the early 20th century, antitrust enforcement, income tax, direct election of senators, represented the most successful structural disruption of concentrated private capital in American history. They were produced by a specific combination of investigative journalism, organized political pressure, and the willingness of a sitting president to use state power against the interests of the people who funded his party. All 3 conditions were present simultaneously. They have not been simultaneously present since. The architecture does not fear individual exposure. It has been exposed repeatedly and survived. What it cannot survive is the loss of legitimacy, the moment when enough people stop accepting its framing of itself as natural, efficient, or inevitable. That moment has not yet arrived. But the question of when it might and what it would look like is not a theoretical one. It is the most important political question of the next generation. The architecture we have followed across these 4 chapters was not built by criminals. It was built by people operating within the rules they had paid to have written. The question worth sitting with is not how to condemn it. That is easy and changes nothing. The harder question is this: if the system that governs your life was designed by people who are not governed by it, what does that require of you? Not anger, clarity. Anger without clarity is the architecture's best defense. Subscribe. The next chapter of the story most people are never shown is already being written.